The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something Matthew Harris had come to recognize as the scent of hope dissolving. He sat in the vinyl chair beside the empty bed, staring at the wrinkled sheets where his wife had lain just hours before. The 4-stand still stood sentinel in the corner, its plastic tubing coiled like a question mark. Outside the window, Boston's skyline glittered with indifferent beauty, tower lights blinking in the October dusk. His phone buzzed. Another message from Sarah's number, but he knew it wasn't her typing anymore. It was probably her assistant, or worse, him. Richard Castellano, the billionaire whose name had become a knife in Matthew's chest over the past 3 weeks. He didn't open it. Instead, he pressed his palm against the cool glass of the window and watched his breath fog the surface. 42 years old, and he felt ancient. The radiation treatments had stolen Sarah's energy, but the recovery had stolen something else entirely. Their marriage, their future, the life they'd built together in their modest Brookline apartment. Matthew's reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, his brown hair threaded with premature gray, his frame thinner than it had been 6 months ago. He'd lost weight too, though not from illness, from worry, from sleeping in hospital chairs, from forgetting to eat while he researched clinical trials and nutrition plans and experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. He'd paid for everything, every cent, $43,000 in medical bills that their insurance deemed not medically necessary. He'd emptied their savings account, the one they'd built together over 12 years of marriage. He'd sold his vintage motorcycle, the Triumph Bonneville his father had restored with him the summer before he died. He'd taken a second mortgage on the apartment. And when that wasn't enough, he'd worked double shifts at the architectural firm, designing luxury condos for people who would never know his name, never see his face, never understand that each blueprint was purchased with stolen sleep and swallowed pride. Sarah had been grateful then. He remembered her squeezing his hand after the first successful treatment, tears streaming down her face, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "You saved me," she'd whispered. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved me." That was August. This was October. The oncologist had declared her in remission 3 weeks ago. Matthew had brought champagne to the appointment, cheap champagne because that's what their budget allowed now, but champagne nonetheless. Sarah had smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. She'd been distant for weeks by then, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she'd turn away to read. "I need to focus on healing," she'd said that night, refusing the champagne. "I need space to find myself again." He'd given her space. He'd been patient. He understood that cancer changed people, that survival came with its own psychological aftermath. He'd read the books, joined the support groups for caregivers, learned about post-traumatic growth and the emotional journey of remission. What he hadn't learned, what no book had prepared him for, was the sight of his wife's suitcases in the hallway 3 days later. "I'm leaving," Sarah had said, her voice steady, rehearsed. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom wearing a dress he'd never seen before. Expensive, tailored, the kind of thing she'd always said was frivolous. Her hair, grown back in soft curls after the chemotherapy, was styled professionally. She looked beautiful. She looked like a stranger. "Where are you going?" Matthew had asked, though some part of him already knew. "I met someone," she'd said, and the words had landed like a diagnosis. "Terminal. Inoperable. Someone who can give me the life I deserve. After everything I've been through, I deserve to be happy." "Who?" he'd asked, though he knew this too. "Richard Castellano." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The name had hung in the air between them. Matthew had recognized it immediately, the tech billionaire, the man whose face appeared on magazine covers, whose yacht was larger than most apartment buildings, whose donations to cancer research were always accompanied by photo opportunities and press releases. "You met him at the hospital," Matthew had said flatly. It wasn't a question. "At the gala. The fundraiser you couldn't attend because you were working." There had been accusation in her voice, as if his absence while working to pay for her treatment, had been a betrayal rather than a sacrifice. "Sarah, don't." She'd held up her hand, and he'd noticed the ring. Not her wedding ring, which still sat in the dish beside their bathroom sink. A different ring. Massive. Diamond-encrusted. Obscene. I've already made my decision. Richard has lawyers. They'll contact you about the divorce. I spent everything on you, Matthew had said, and hated how his voice cracked. I gave everything. And I'm grateful, she'd said, in the tone of someone thanking a waiter. But gratitude isn't love, Matthew. You were comfortable, safe, predictable. I need more than that now. I need someone who can actually provide for me without making it feel like martyrdom. She'd left that afternoon. The lawyers had contacted him the next day. The papers arrived by courier, thick, official, accompanied by a letter from a firm whose name had too many ampersands. The divorce would be quick, they assured him. Mrs. Harris, soon to be Mrs. Castellano, was willing to forego any claim to their shared assets, given that Mr. Harris had already depleted the marital accounts. That phrase had burned. As if he'd been reckless. As if he'd gambled their money away rather than using it to keep her alive. Matthew stood now in the empty hospital room, a place he'd visited so many times over 6 months that the nurses knew his coffee order. The evening shift supervisor, Patricia, appeared in the doorway. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s with kind eyes and zero tolerance for self-pity. Still here? She asked gently. Just leaving, Matthew said. I heard, Patricia said. About Sarah. I'm sorry. Matthew nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. For what it's worth, Patricia continued, I've seen a lot of families come through here. A lot of marriages tested by illness. You were one of the good ones. You never missed a treatment. You held her hand through every scan. You asked questions, took notes, advocated for her when she was too tired to advocate for herself. She paused. Some people, when they get their health back, they forget who held them when they were breaking. That's not your fault. That's a failure of character, and you can't fix character. Thank you, Matthew managed. You'll be okay, Patricia said. Men like you always are. You're a builder. You'll rebuild. But as Matthew walked out of the hospital for what he knew would be the last time, he wasn't sure he believed her. He felt hollowed out, a structure with sound architecture but no foundation left to stand on. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and car exhaust. Matthew walked to the parking garage, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. His car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a temperamental starter, sat in its usual spot on the 3rd level. He'd parked here so many times he could navigate to it blind. He drove home on autopilot, through streets he'd memorized, past landmarks that had once felt like waypoints in a shared life. The coffee shop where Sarah liked to get her morning latte. The park where they'd had their first date. A picnic that had been rained out, forcing them to huddle under a gazebo and talk for 4 hours. The bookstore where she'd worked when they first met, where he'd come in 3 times a week to buy books he didn't need just for an excuse to talk to her. All of it felt archaeological now. Ruins of a civilization that no longer existed. The apartment was dark when he arrived. He flipped on the lights and was confronted with absence. Sarah had taken most of her things, but she'd left behind the detritus of their life together. Photos on the mantel, her books on the shelves, the coffee mug she'd used every morning, the one that said "World's Okayest Wife," a joke gift from her sister. Matthew sank onto the couch and allowed himself to feel it. The grief, the betrayal, the suffocating unfairness of it all. He'd saved her life, and she'd left him for someone richer. Someone who hadn't had to sacrifice anything. Someone who could afford her chemotherapy with the loose change in his couch cushions. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. It was an email from an address he didn't recognize. Email protected. The subject line read, "Urgent. Regarding the estate of James Theodore Whitmore." Matthew almost deleted it. It looked like spam, like one of those scam emails promising inheritances from distant relatives who didn't exist. But something made him open it. Dear Mr. Harris, this correspondence concerns a matter of significant legal and financial importance. My firm represents the estate of the late James Theodore Whitmore, who passed away on September 3, 2025. Mr. Whitmore was your maternal grandfather. Matthew's breath caught. He'd never known his grandfather. His mother, Elizabeth Harris, had been estranged from her family since before Matthew was born. She'd never spoken about them, and when Matthew asked as a child, she'd simply said, "Some families are better left in the past." Elizabeth had died 4 years ago, breast cancer, and had taken her secrets with her. The email continued, "Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions regarding his estate. Despite the estrangement, he followed your life from a distance and chose to name you as the sole beneficiary of his trust. The trust, established in 1987, has matured to a current value of approximately $190 million. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss the terms of the inheritance and begin the transfer process. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Eleanor Pemberton, Senior Partner, Pemberton and Associates." Matthew read the email 3 times, then a 4th. His hands were shaking. $190 million. The number was absurd, incomprehensible. It had to be a mistake or a scam, or some cosmic joke played by a universe that had already proven its sense of humor was cruel. He called the number listed in the email signature. A receptionist answered on the 2nd ring, professional, crisp. "Pemberton and Associates." "I received an email," Matthew said, his voice strange in his own ears, "about an inheritance. From James Whitmore." "Mr. Harris?" the receptionist said warmly, as if she'd been expecting his call. "Yes. Miss Pemberton has been hoping to hear from you. Can you hold for just a moment?" Before Matthew could respond, classical music filled his ear. He waited, his heart hammering, convinced that at any second the receptionist would return and tell him there'd been a mistake. "Wrong, Matthew Harris. Sorry for the confusion." Instead, a woman's voice came on the line, older, authoritative, kind. "Mr. Harris, I'm Eleanor Pemberton. Thank you for calling. I know this must come as quite a shock." "Is it real?" Matthew asked bluntly. "Completely real," Eleanor said. "Your grandfather was a very successful investor. He made his initial fortune in commercial real estate in the 1960s and diversified into tech stocks in the early 1980s. He was, by all accounts, a financial genius with terrible personal relationships." "I never met him," Matthew said. "He knew that. He also knew why. Your mother, Elizabeth, made her choice to leave, and James respected that, even though it broke his heart. But he never stopped watching out for you. He knew about your education, your career, your marriage. He knew about Sarah's illness." Matthew felt a chill. "He knew. He called me 6 months ago," Eleanor said. "He was 93, in poor health, and he wanted to update his will one final time. He told me about your wife's cancer diagnosis, about the medical bills, about the second mortgage. He said, and I quote, 'My grandson is the kind of man who gives everything and asks for nothing. I was never that kind of man. I owe him more than money, but money is all I have left to give.'" Matthew's throat tightened. "I don't understand. If he wanted to help, why didn't he help then? Why wait until now?" "Pride," Eleanor said simply, "and stubbornness. He thought your mother might have told you about him, poisoned you against him. He was afraid you'd refuse his help. So he decided to wait, to leave everything to you after he was gone, when you couldn't refuse out of pride or loyalty to Elizabeth." "This is insane," Matthew whispered. "It's also legally binding," Eleanor said. "The trust is yours, Mr. Harris. No conditions, no strings attached. Your grandfather just asked one thing, that you use some of it to be happy." Those were his exact words. "Tell Matthew to use some of it to be happy." They scheduled a meeting for the following morning. Matthew hung up and sat in the darkness of his apartment, processing. 3 weeks ago he'd been married. 2 weeks ago he'd been abandoned. Yesterday he'd been broke and heartbroken. Today he was worth $190 million. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. Sarah had left him for a billionaire, had walked away from 12 years of marriage because she deserved someone who could provide. Someone who could give her the life of luxury she decided she was owed after surviving cancer. She had no idea what she'd walked away from. Matthew's first instinct was petty, human. He wanted to call her, to tell her, to watch her face when she realized her mistake. He wanted to post it on social media, to rent a billboard outside Castellano's penthouse, to make sure everyone who knew their story knew how spectacularly she'd miscalculated. But he didn't. Instead, he sat on the couch in the apartment they'd shared, in the wreckage of the life they'd built, and he let himself feel something he hadn't felt in months. Relief. Not relief at the money, though that was profound. Relief at something deeper. Relief that he was finally, definitively free. Free from the weight of her ingratitude. Free from the exhausting work of loving someone who had stopped loving him back. Free from the terrible hope that she might change her mind and come back. The money didn't change who he was. It didn't validate his worth or prove that he'd been right to sacrifice everything for her treatment. His worth had never been in question, not to the people who mattered, not to Patricia, the night shift supervisor, not to his colleagues who'd covered his shifts without complaint, not to his grandfather who'd watched from a distance and seen exactly who Matthew was. Sarah had looked at him and seen only what he couldn't give her. She'd measured their love in bank statements and found it lacking. That was her failure, not his. Matthew stood and walked to the window. The city lights sprawled before him, each one a life, a story, a struggle. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably already in Castellano's penthouse, surrounded by luxury she thought she'd earned by surviving. Somewhere out there, people were fighting battles as hard as the one he'd just survived, harder, maybe without the sudden windfall to cushion the fall. He thought about his grandfather, a man he'd never known but who'd known him. A man who'd made mistakes, who'd lost his daughter to those mistakes, but who'd spent his final years trying to correct what he could. The inheritance wasn't about money. It was about recognition, about being seen. Matthew had been seen his whole life, by his mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college, by his late father, who'd taught him that character was measured in quiet moments, not grand gestures, by Sarah once, before cancer and fear had changed her into someone he didn't recognize. And now, by a grandfather he'd never met, who'd looked at Matthew's life and seen something worth rewarding. The meeting with Eleanor Pemberton the next morning was surprisingly brief. She explained the trust structure, the tax implications, the various accounts and holdings. There were properties, a brownstone in Back Bay, a beach house on the Cape, commercial real estate in 3 states. There were investment portfolios, bonds, stocks and companies Matthew had heard of and dozens he hadn't. "It's yours to do with as you please," Eleanor said, sliding a folder across her mahogany desk. "Though I'd recommend keeping our firm on retainer for management, at least initially. This kind of wealth requires expertise to maintain." "I will," Matthew said. He was still processing, still half convinced he'd wake up and discover this was an elaborate dream. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. She pulled out a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather left you a letter. He wrote it 2 weeks before he died." Matthew took the envelope with trembling hands. Eleanor stood. "I'll give you privacy to read it. Take your time. There's no rush." When she'd left, Matthew opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten, the script shaky but legible. "Matthew, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you know the truth. I'm rich, you're my grandson, and I was too much of a coward to meet you while I was alive. Your mother left when she was 19. She had good reasons. I was a terrible father. Absent, demanding, cold. I built an empire and lost a family. By the time I realized what I'd done, Elizabeth wanted nothing to do with me. I respected her wishes. It was the least I could do, but I kept track of you. Hired investigators, read every article about your work, looked at your social media profiles like a stranger at the window of a lit house. I saw you grow into the kind of man I never was. Generous, faithful, kind. When I heard about Sarah's illness, I wanted to help. I wanted to pay for everything to make it easy for you. My lawyers advised against it. They said you might refuse, might see it as manipulation. So I waited, and I watched you nearly destroy yourself trying to save her. I'm sorry I waited. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to reach out while I could still shake your hand and tell you I'm proud of you. This money won't fix what's broken. It won't change the past. But maybe it can give you freedom. Freedom to build the life you want, to be generous without sacrificing yourself, to be kind without being taken advantage of. Your mother used to say I thought money could solve everything. She was right to leave. But she was wrong about one thing: money can't solve everything, but it can solve some things. Can buy you time, space, options, safety. Use it well. Be happy. And know that somewhere, a foolish old man is watching and hoping he finally did right by you. Your grandfather, James. Matthew read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it back in the envelope. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. There'd been enough tears already. He thought about what came next. He could be vindictive, could let Sarah find out through mutual friends, through the inevitable publicity when the estate transfer became public record. Could let her suffer the knowledge of what she'd walked away from. Or he could be free. He chose freedom. Matthew hired Eleanor's firm to manage the estate. He kept the brownstone in Back Bay but sold the beach house. Too many memories of family vacations he'd never had. He donated $5 million to cancer research, specifically to programs that helped patients who couldn't afford treatment. He set up a scholarship fund at his mother's alma mater for first-generation college students. He paid off the second mortgage. He replaced his 10-year-old Civic with a reliable Volvo, nice, but not flashy. He bought back his father's motorcycle from the collector who'd purchased it, paying 3 times what it was worth because some things mattered more than money. And then he went back to work. His colleagues were stunned when he returned to the architecture firm. "You don't need to work," his boss said, confused. "You could retire, travel the world, buy an island." "I like working," Matthew said simply. "I like building things." What he didn't say was that work gave him purpose, structure, a reason to wake up that wasn't just managing wealth. He didn't need the money, but he needed the meaning. Sarah found out 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Matthew heard about it through a mutual friend who'd remained loyal to him. Apparently, she'd seen a newspaper article about James Whitmore's estate and the philanthropic grandson who'd inherited his fortune. She'd called the friend, hysterical, demanding to know if it was the same Matthew Harris. It was. She'd tried to contact him. Emails, texts, calls from unfamiliar numbers. He blocked them all. There was nothing she could say that he needed to hear. Then Richard Castellano's lawyers reached out. The letter was professional, carefully worded. Mr. Castellano wished to discuss a potential business venture and thought Mr. Harris might be interested in investing in Castellano's new tech startup. There was no mention of Sarah, but the subtext was clear. Castellano knew, Sarah had told him, and they wanted access to Matthew's fortune. Matthew's response was brief. "Not interested. Please don't contact me again." 3 months after the divorce, Matthew was having coffee in the hospital cafeteria. He still visited sometimes, bringing gift cards and encouragement to families going through what he'd been through, when Patricia sat down across from him. "You look better," she said. "I feel better," Matthew admitted. "I heard about your grandfather, the inheritance. Some of the nurses were talking about it." Matthew nodded. He'd expected this, the way news spread through small communities. The hospital staff had been his community for 6 months. "Are you going to tell Sarah?" Patricia asked bluntly. "She knows," Matthew said. "And no, we're not getting back together, if that's what you're asking." Patricia smiled. "Good. You deserve better than someone who mistakes gratitude for love and thinks wealth equals worth." "Richard Castellano is actually broke," Matthew said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken this aloud. "I hired a forensic accountant out of curiosity. His company's underwater. He's kept up the appearance of wealth through debt and publicity, but he's leveraged to the breaking point. I give him 6 months before bankruptcy." Patricia's eyes widened. "Does Sarah know?" "Not yet," Matthew said. "But she will. And when she does, she'll realize she left a man who actually loved her for a man who needed her as a trophy to maintain his image." "That's poetic justice," Patricia said. "It's just sad," Matthew replied. And he meant it. There was no satisfaction in Sarah's impending disappointment, no joy in being proven right. Just sadness for a woman who'd survived cancer only to lose herself in the aftermath. A year after the divorce, Matthew met someone new. Her name was Rachel, and she was a structural engineer working on a hospital expansion project he was consulting on. She was brilliant, funny, passionate about her work, and had no idea who Matthew was or what he was worth until their 4th date. when he finally told her about the inheritance. "That must have been surreal," she said. "It was," Matthew admitted. "It still is sometimes." "Does it bother you?" Rachel asked. "That Sarah left before she knew?" Matthew considered the question carefully. They were walking along the Charles River, the autumn air crisp and clean, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered stars. "No," he said finally, "because she didn't leave because I was poor. She left because she thought I was poor. There's a difference. She didn't leave for money. She left because she thought money equaled love, provision equaled worth. Even if I'd had the inheritance then, the problem was still who she'd become." "You're very philosophical about it," Rachel said. "I've had time to process," Matthew said. "And honestly, I'm grateful. She showed me who she was before I wasted more years on someone who didn't share my values." "What are your values?" Rachel asked. Matthew thought about his grandfather, about Patricia, about all the people who'd seen him in his darkest moment and recognized something worth preserving. "Showing up," he said. "Being present. Doing the hard work even when it's thankless. Building things that last, buildings, relationships, legacies. Using whatever resources you have to make the world slightly better than you found it." Rachel smiled. "Those are good values." "They're the only ones that matter," Matthew said. 2 years after the divorce, Matthew was designing a new wing for the hospital where Sarah had been treated. It would be called the Elizabeth Harris Memorial Wing, named for his mother, funded by his inheritance, dedicated to helping patients who couldn't afford care. Patricia was at the groundbreaking ceremony. So was Eleanor Pemberton. So was Rachel, who'd become his partner in both life and work. Sarah wasn't there, though Matthew had sent her an invitation. She was recently divorced from Richard Castellano, whose business had indeed collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving her with nothing but legal fees and tabloid notoriety. Matthew had heard she'd reached out to mutual friends, trying to find a way to contact him, to apologize, to explain. He'd blocked those attempts not out of cruelty but out of self-preservation. Some doors, once closed, needed to stay that way. As he stood in the hospital courtyard, watching construction crews break ground on a building that would help thousands of people, Matthew thought about the journey that had brought him here. The pain, the betrayal, the unexpected windfall, the slow rebuilding of a life he could be proud of. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I saw the news about the hospital wing. It's beautiful. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're happy." Matthew read it once, then deleted it. He didn't need her apology. He didn't need her regret. He had something better. A life built on his own terms, shaped by his values, shared with people who saw him for who he was rather than what he had. He thought about his grandfather's letter, the instruction to be happy. He thought about his mother, who'd left wealth and privilege behind to build a life of meaning and integrity. He thought about his father, who'd taught him that character was forged in quiet moments of doing the right thing when no one was watching. And he thought about Sarah, who'd looked at his sacrifice and seen only scarcity, who'd mistaken his generosity for weakness, who'd traded love for the illusion of security and found neither. "You ready?" Rachel asked, appearing at his side. "I'm ready," Matthew said. They walked toward the podium together, toward the future he was building, toward the legacy he was choosing. Not because of the money, though the money helped, because of who he'd always been, who he'd been raised to be, who he'd chosen to remain even when the world tested him. The cancer had taken Sarah's health. The betrayal had taken their marriage. But nothing, not illness, not abandonment, not the cruel irony of inherited wealth, had taken Matthew's integrity. That had always been his real fortune, the thing no one could give him and no one could take away. As he stepped up to speak about the hospital wing, about his mother's memory, about the importance of caring for the vulnerable, Matthew realized something profound. Sarah hadn't left him for a billionaire. She'd left him because she couldn't recognize real wealth when it was holding her hand through chemotherapy, working double shifts to pay her bills, sacrificing everything without asking for gratitude. Real wealth wasn't in trust funds or stock portfolios or luxury penthouses. Real wealth was in showing up, in being present, in loving people through their worst moments and celebrating them through their best. Matthew had always been rich in the ways that mattered. The inheritance hadn't changed that. It had just given him the resources to share that richness with the world. "Subscribe to channel name," he would have said. If this were the kind of story that ended with a call to action, where silence is never forgotten. But this wasn't that kind of story. This was the kind of story where a good man faced betrayal, received an unexpected blessing, and chose to remain exactly who he'd always been, just with better tools to build the world he wanted to see. And that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.